Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to the On the Way Home podcast. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, where I have the good fortune to work with some amazing people all across the top of the GTA, York Region, Durham, and Peel, trying to prevent and end homelessness. That's what we do and what we have done at Blue Door for the past 40 years. We do not do this podcast alone, however. We actually do it in partnership with the incredible folks of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They are doing incredible work every day. They are the voice for Canadians, for this sector. When things like budgets go through or other things happen, they're pushing hard for things that are important to the sector, like a housing benefit. And they have the ear of the government and are trying to make big change happen. If you want to see what the Alliance is up to, go to caeh.ca. There's all sorts of different opportunities for you to get involved in as either citizens or as organizations, and they're doing incredible work. So check them out and be generous if you'd like to donate to either Blue Door or the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. This podcast, maybe you're listening to it on the way home, as our title suggests. You're stuck in traffic. Maybe you're sitting back on the weekend having a coffee and listening to it. We try and celebrate all the amazing and innovative things happening, people that are doing good work in the space, the sector of housing, homelessness, health, poverty. Today's guest is no exception. Today I have with me Ricardo Tranjan. And Ricardo's going to tell us a little bit about his journey. He recently wrote a book that is really, really interesting and impactful. And we're going to talk all about that and tell you how you can get a copy of that and read it. Very, very just thinking differently. And I think right now we just had a federal budget that passed recently in Ontario. We had a provincial budget that passed as well, neither which really pushed too hard on the housing front or really helped led a lot of resources towards working us through homelessness or affordable housing solutions. And so it was difficult to swallow. Listen, the federal budget can't be everything to everyone always. So, we've said our piece. We've told the federal government how we feel. Now it's time to get to work, right, and build on solutions that we can hand to the government now in time for next year's budget as we move forward. But, before we get to that, let's get to today's guest. Ricardo, welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you here. We start the show always with the same question because it's a very personal one, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Well, nowadays, home for me is this very concrete place called Manor Park East. Is a neighborhood of Ottawa. My spouse and I, we moved around quite a bit, but about 4 or 5 years ago, we moved here, and we're making it home. I remember just a couple months after we moved, my 5-year-old looked at me and said, "I like here." I was like, "Okay, dude, let's stick around then." And this is where we weathered the pandemic. This is where we had our second child. We're part of a small group of parents that support each other a lot. The neighborhood will go through some transitions in terms of redevelopments in the near future. So there's some organizing, some conversations about what it should look like, who should have a voice and participate in this process. So there's a lot happening, and it's a great place to be right now. And we're very happy and fortunate to be here.
Very cool. And if I hear you correctly, not to put words in your mouth, but I hear a lot about what makes it really home for you is that sense of community. So congratulations on that and the birth of your second child. Um, let's learn a little bit about you. Um, what, tell me a little bit about your journey into the sector, Ricardo.
Yes, well, I grew up in Brazil in the 1980s and the 1990s, which were pretty chaotic times for us. It was the entail of the military regime. They were starting to withdraw in the 1980s. So that was a big change for everybody. And that was followed by a very serious economic crisis that had all sorts of consequences and impacted people quite negatively. I was living in this very large city called São Paulo, and crime rates went off the roof at that time. So it was a very sort of busy and sort of there was a lot of happening socially, economically, politically. So kind of in the book, I get a little bit into it. I just kind of mention a couple pieces and beats of that story and how sort of triggered, I think, an interest in understanding how all of these things come together and how they lead to the outcomes that we see. But then eventually, I came to Canada in my early 20s, and that was thanks to a very generous scholarship by Trent University. Uh, Paying university in Brazil would have been hard for me in my situation. Never mind, having an education abroad, but Trent and the Peterborough community, which I refer to as my Canadian hometown, made that possible. And then I got really into it. The opportunity to just kind of read and understand this stuff was fascinating. So, an undergraduate led to a master's degree, that led to a doctorate degree. And but when I was done with all of those studies, I wanted to go back to sort of more applied work and research that in debates that were more directly related to what was going on and sort of try and help and shape um, social and political outcomes. So I got a job with the city of Toronto. I worked there for 4 years, I think. I was helping to develop, then to manage the city's poverty reduction strategy. And then eventually I moved to the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, the really cool think tank where I work right now. And I do all sorts of research, mostly this sort of political economy of social policy, including housing.
Very cool. Thanks for shaping that journey, and it just even from your early days, and how that kind of informed in your journey into this work. Now you've done a lot of great work around poverty reduction. You continue to do that. We often talk in this podcast about the importance of good policy over bad, and how that's led us down this path to where we are now. But you can add to your roster of great work author. Now, this is your first book? Is this your first book?
It's my second book.
Second book.
The first one was more focused on Brazil, which was the sort of the topic of my academic research, was essentially trying to understand a little bit about that messy context in which I grew up and focusing on participatory democracy and how participatory democracy in some ways help to bring about policies, economic policies that have really good impact for low and moderate income families. So that was a more academic piece, and it was out a few years ago.
But there's themes of that in this new book. The new book, the second book, so you're a multi-published author, let's say. Now, the Tenant Class, there are some themes about what you're just speaking about, right? And how we kind of contribute to that. Can you talk to us about how did the Tenant Class come about? Was it a long process? Did you start this years ago? Was it during the pandemic? What made you think about writing this book and on this topic?
Yeah, during the pandemic, I got pulled more into housing debates for a number of reasons of how our team was divided. Um, I tended to focus a lot on the income side of low and moderate income households in Canada, looking at income supports, looking at the wages, and what sort of what composition their income, or the composition of their income, and different levels of income, and so on and so forth. But during the pandemic, I moved a little bit to talk more about rent, in part because we didn't have any supports directly focused on tenants, though CERB helped a lot. And I started producing more on housing and rent in particular. And then sort of, after the first couple of years of the pandemic, I decided to write something slightly more substantive, sink my teeth on that housing question, as some have called. And then what I did was I just sat down, and sort of brought my political economics kind of background and training into this sort of new question of housing in Canada, and really high rents, and questions of housing affordability, and all of that we kind of know well. And I wrote a 2-page proposal. And I strongly believe that social movements should tell researchers what to do, and not the other way around. So I circulated that 2-page proposal around, and passed it to tenant organizers in 6, 7 cities across the country, and said, can we talk about this? Do you have time to read it? Can we talk about this? Can I call you? Can I come by and have some coffee and talk about this? And they did. They talked to me about it, and the feedback was really positive. They said, no, there's something here. There's something we haven't heard. There's something that reflects our experience. Is do that. And I was like, okay, and that got me really enthused about the project, knowing that it seemed that it was going to be helpful. It was going to be useful to folks organizing. So then I sat down and I started writing it, and then kept getting slightly larger and larger. And I was like, man, I think I have a book here, not a report. And then that's how it came about. I pitched it to Between the Lines, and they were excited about it, and they helped me to bring it to the finishing line.
Very, very cool. It's fantastic, and I'm sure. I mean, you could probably write 6 books on this, but I love right at the beginning, like that talks about you kind of turn this whole idea or the thought process of housing crisis on its head, right? The traditional thinking. Can you talk a little bit more about that for our listeners?
Yes, the book starts by arguing that there is no housing crisis. And by that, I don't mean in any way to belittle the very difficult experience that so many people are having right now, in sort of finding or maintaining housing. But it's just the notion that if this were a real crisis, the sort of level of response that we would expect from governments would be very different, right? This so-called housing crisis has been going on for 70 or 100 years, depending how you want to count, for a very long time. And we keep talking about very similar palliative solutions to the problem, and we haven't really kind of gone after the what I consider to be the fundamental issue, which is profit making in housing. The fact that housing for a lot of people are just an asset, a way of making money or moving money around, parking money, all sorts of things that happen in the financial market, and that housing is just one of the instruments for that kind of activity. So I agree. I argue that there is no housing crisis. What we have here is a market that is set up to allow some people to profit, and profit quite a bit, and accumulate wealth year after year, decade after decade, and pass that wealth from generation to generation, whereas other folks are constantly in a situation of housing security, is struggling to make ends meet, is struggling to pay rent because rent is too high. And it's too high because a large share of their rent is profit that is making the other group wealthier and wealthier. So there is no housing crisis for a large share of the population. There's no housing crisis for a large share of businesses who are in this and work operating in this sector, and who are putting out, like, double-digit profit margins every year, even during the pandemic, where we had a third of the economy shut down. We had historically high unemployment rates. You look at some of the real estate investment trusts, you look at the kind of profit margins they managed to achieve that year. It's extremely high, especially in that context. So that's why I argue there is no housing crisis. There is a market that is allowing some to get wealth and while keeping others in a situation of housing security. But there's a very practical implication to that argument, which is depending on how we diagnose the crisis, or depending on how we diagnose the problem, it will lead us to different conversations about the solution. And that's eventually what I want to get to, right?
Now, thank you so much for that. That's fascinating. What has the response been so far from the book when people say that? Because, automatically, I guess, when you say there's no housing crisis, people throw their hands up until they read further and say, okay, I understand a bit. But has the response been solid so far?
Yes, it's a mix of response, of surprise, of, well, tell me more. But as soon as I just spell it out, the argument, and say, well, there are some people who are just getting really wealthy with this and have been getting wealthier for decades, where there is another share that is just struggling by and have been for a long time. It's not a crisis for everybody. Some are getting away with it, some are suffering from it. People like, yeah, that makes sense. And I usually get a positive response.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're really like these people that are getting really wealthy are kind of dictating the market for everyone else, driving it up, forcing people out. And I think you see in Canada, there's almost two classes of people. Like if you're a homeowner, you're someone. If you're not, you're a no one, right? And it's really odd, this fascination with Canadians of home ownership. That's the dream. You made it when you finally own your home, which most of us never do because the bank really owns it. But you address some of that in your book, not that, but you talk about some of the myths around tenants. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the political and economic is never too detached from the sort of cultural aspects, right? And there's a self reinforcing relationship between this kind of two sets of factors. And in the case of Canada, I agree with you. We have a kind of like an obsession with home ownership. It is a question of a status, and we can see that clearly when we look at some of the decisions people have been making recently when purchasing a home. The amount of money they're willing to invest on it, the fact that they're willing to forego inspections, the fact that they're willing to pay more than the asking prices. There's all of this um, um, decisions that are irrational from a financial perspective, but you see it day after day, and it can only be explained, I think, by the fact that it's not only that folks are, you know, committed to owning a place per se, that the financial decision, but there's some emotional motivation also behind those decisions that explain what we may call it the irrationality of it a little bit. um, and also has to do with the fact that I think that has to do with the fact that housing security, unfortunately, in Canada is it's hard to achieve through renting, right? Like I think ultimately, a lot of people are trying to buy a house not because they're in love with the idea of spending their Sunday fixing the basement, but it's because that's the way they think it's gonna allow them to be more securely housed. Um, and so I think there's a bunch of myths about renting that contribute to that. And in the book, we have a chapter where we go through some of these myths. One of them is this notion that the renting is a phase, that people grow out of renting. Um, So kind of like when we talk about the minimum wage, we have this argument like, young people, they earn a minimum wage, but eventually they get a better job, and so there's no not necessarily a lot of impetus behind raising the minimum wage if you think that it's only people living with their parents who are earning that, which it's not true. There's a lot of older adults and even seniors working for a minimum wage. And this is the same thing with housing. 70% of the primary maintainers in tenant households are folks 35 years of age or older. 22% are actually older than 65%. I joke in the book that if there's such a thing as a stereotypical tenant, that is a person who has once upon a time used a fax machine and remembers doing so, because it's not a young person necessarily. I think another myth that I talk about in the book is this notion that tenants don't pay property taxes, which it has implications for city level activism, and how entitled people feel to participate in debates at the local level and to make demands of the municipal governments. And as we know, property taxes are built into the rent, and people pay that, even if indirectly through their landlord. Another myth is this notion that, or this assumption, I think more than a notion, that tenants are not as active in the labor force. That a large share of tenants are either on social assistance or other kinds of benefits. And yes, a part of them are, but when you compare um, the labor force participation of tenants, people who live in tenant households and people who live in home owned households, it's very similar. It's like 64 to 66%. So it's also not true. And the only reason it's important to talk about that is because of a broader assumption that people who rent, they do so because they didn't work hard enough, or they didn't try hard enough, because if they had, they would have managed to pull themselves by the bootstraps. That whole sort of mythology about the self-made person. And is the fact is, like, no, they're working in low-paying jobs, and they're paying a lot in rent. There's not a lot in the end of the month to save to do anything else. And then the final myth that I talk a little bit about is the notion that everyone wants to own. And that's where I go a little bit into that. My first point, I say, well, what people are looking for is housing security, and if they can achieve that through means other than ownership, you will see, and we have some survey data on this. We see that people who chose that option too.
Everything you're saying, it rings true. So I'm a renter in Toronto. My family and I, we rent, and quite often my partner Sylvia will say, at any point the landlord can ask us to leave, right? So we don't have security. We don't want to do that. We want permanency, right? Things like, and what you're saying is we're just throwing away our money rather than seeing it as that's a housing cost, it's cost of living, right? That's, and also too with people, you don't really have a say because yeah, you're not really permanent because you're not a homeowner. You don't own part of, like, so everything is ringing true around that. And I think, in different parts of the world where there's more renters than owners. I mean, that's just not the same. But in Canada, for some reason, yeah, you really haven't made it till you own that house, and it's so true. All those different myths. But I think the reality is, and the big question keeping some parents awake, how is my child ever going to be able to afford to own their own house? And why are we so fascinated or linked to that's the only way they'll be successful if they own their home house some way? So it's changing the mindset. And I think people need to read your book too, because that will help maybe wrap their heads around that too.
Parents need to tell their kids, I'm gonna love you even if you rent for life. That might give people a sense of easy and start being so concerned about it. But jokes aside, I think that is actually extremely important, because going back to your very first question, what is home for you? For me, home right now, it's is where my kids' school is, and I want to be able to tell my kid, no, 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 you like this school, it's fine. You're gonna go, you're gonna stay there until seventh grade. It's fine. And again, that kind of security of tenure, it's more easily achieved, at least the perception of the security of tenure is more easily achieved through home ownership than renting. And I think that's one of the big issues behind here. There's also the question of long-term financial security, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people now are, counting on their homes to be their retirement plan, in large part due to the fact that pension plans are more and more rare for folks in the private sector. In the public sector, is still a little bit more common. But if you are in the private sector, you're less likely to have a pension plan, and so you're betting a lot on your housing, kind of feeling that purpose, which has all sorts of negative consequences for the market in general.
Yeah, it's so true. And what you're saying there, when we ask that question, most of the time when people say, "What does home mean?" The word safety and security comes up all the time. It's not about the four walls. It's not about the bricks and mortar. It is about the safety. And I think that's sometimes what people worry about. How am I going to be secure if? And you know what? There is some validity to that too. To the 60 days notice, and your life can be upended, right? With things turning around. I think we have to change our mentality. I mentioned before, we talk quite often on this show. We've had people on that said, listen, homelessness was an issue, always has been in Canada and the US, but even more so in the late 80s, early 90s, when Canada changed policy and their policies changed and the feds got out of the social housing game, and we saw homelessness skyrocket, right? So it's a result of that policy. In your later chapters, you talk about the class structure and look back on how political history has contributed. I'm hoping you could expand a little bit around that.
Yes, I'm sort of a nerd for social history, and I find it quite useful sometimes to take a step back and to look at these kinds of issues that concern us from a slightly more historical perspective. So I did that in this piece as well. And I went into some of the more sort of archives and historical works, and brought uncovered some of the movements from the past that were struggling to to achieve housing security. One of the cases that I discuss in the book goes back to right before Confederation in Prince Edward Island, and then I talk about other cases. And I think the goal of that sort of historic analysis is to show folks this is something that has been going on for quite some times. It has to do with how we're structuring the housing market, the fact that we are allowing the market to be in charge, and we are heavily relying on the market to deliver housing, whereas the goal of private market, it's not to deliver housing security. It's almost unfair, quote unquote, to expect them from them, because that's not what they do. Private markets deliver profit, and we cannot constantly be asking, why is not delivering housing security? Why is it not making people feel safe in their homes? Why is not allowing people to promise their kids that they're not going to move to another school? Why is not doing all of these things? Well, because that's not what markets do. Markets, especially poorly regulated markets, which is the case here with our housing market, what they do, what they have done, and that's the historical perspective, what they have done for quite some time here in Canada, is to deliver profit. And so that's a little bit the goal and the gist of that economic analysis. Of the historical economic analysis. And then I go a little bit into also into the role of history and storytelling and how we tell these stories. I think there's a lot of really good organizing and social movement work and activism in Canadian history that doesn't get enough attention. And I say that as someone who, spent a lot of time studying and learning about social movements in Brazil. And then when I moved here, obviously I was kind of interested in doing the same. It's like, this is where I am right now, and eventually became my home. And I was like, I want to learn more about the history of this country and the history, what happened here and how things came about. And I find it really hard to find information on that. I kept stumbling into this sort of official narrative of Canada, and there's like one great man after another having big thoughts in some Ottawa chateau and deciding where the country is going to go. And I couldn't find, the actual history of actual people who struggled and fought and organized and put up immense fights against the economic system, and managed to make space for working class organizing, for teacher unions, for all the great movements that we saw in Toronto as well, anti-poverty movements, the movement that brought about rent controls, all of that. It's kind of hard to find. And it takes a nerd like me spend a lot of time looking for this kind of thing, and then you can start uncovering some threads, and you start getting a little bit more of understanding of that whole history of normal people in normal times, just struggling and fighting an economic system that's sort of rigged and set up mostly to exploit rather than to support them. So I talk a little bit about that, and it's kind of like a call for us to document and to learn and to talk about this great Canadian tradition of organizing and putting up a fight.
Yeah, now more than ever, that's needed, right? I mean, it's quite interesting, because I think quite often we do look at the government to come up with solutions. And quite often, it's not them that are coming up with the solutions. It is the activists and leaders in the community that are, with their tireless efforts, that push and put that idea that then, say, a government might take credit for, because they're funding it, and move forward, right? Even the idea around the national housing strategy, I mean, that came from years and years of people saying we need a national housing strategy. And now we're saying, hey, we need a separate Indigenous housing strategy. People are pushing hard for that, and they're tirelessly working, but we don't document that. At the end of the day, what's recognized in the paper is the Liberal government had a national housing strategy, et cetera, moving forward. Fascinating stuff. Really, really, really cool. And thanks for sharing. So if people want to get a hold of this book, they want to read it, and they should, and they want to share it, where can they get it?
Well, I think the easiest way right now is to go on the internet, and then you can search for the Tenant Class and Between the Lines. And the first page that's going to come up is the website of this amazing publishing company. And then you can click there, and you can order a pre-order a volume. They're going to start shipping out on May 2nd. Hopefully, we're going to get them to public libraries too, so more folks can have access to it. And it is my personal commitment as the author to help anyone who's a tenant or an organizer who really wants to read this book, but who needs to prioritize other expenses. Just call me. Just give me an email, send me an email, and I'll figure out a way to get you a copy. It shouldn't, the price shouldn't be a barrier for those who really need to, who are really struggling with housing to get a hold of this.
Amazing. This sounds like it's quite a passion project for you. We are grateful in the sector for this kind of work. It certainly helps us a lot. We'll share it widely. I encourage everyone to go buy this book, share it widely. Ricardo, thank you so much for all your work in this sector and for writing this book, and your contributions. It's so appreciated. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you too. Thank you all too for the amazing work you do day in and day out. My work here is maybe narrating a little bit of this work, but you guys are actually doing the actual work and the actual really hard work. I'm just narrating a little bit about it and sharing a little bit about those stories, but you're doing all the hard pieces of it.
You're giving us the tools to do the job. It's so appreciated, man. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best with this book moving forward.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I encourage you, it's the Tenant Class, In Between the Lines. Check it out. Just Google it up. You can find this book. It's fascinating. I love what Ricardo's saying. There's a lot of wisdom, knowledge. That's what we do here. On the way home is we drop awareness, education, knowledge. That's the only way we're going to move forward and change. So check out this book. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on the way home.